At this point in time, sans going after the supreme leader's office, and again, that the political establishment, it's going to be hard to get the protesters back on the streets to see something that could give them that shot in the arm.
Today is Wednesday, January 21st. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. Anti-government protests erupted across all 31 of Iran's provinces in what looked like the most serious challenge to the regime in years. Tens of thousands of people marched through the streets chanting anti-government slogans. The regime responded with overwhelming force, using live fire and carrying out mass arrests to crush the demonstrations. The verified death toll now stands at over 3,000, but human rights groups estimate the true number of those killed is between 12,000 and 20,000, with another 300,000 injured. The full scale of the crackdown remains unclear because the Iranian government shut down internet access and most phone services. Despite repeated threats directed at the regime, President Trump ultimately backed away from striking Iran. Now the world is watching to see what comes next, whether there will be American action, and whether the regime can ultimately maintain its grip on power. To help us better understand the situation in Iran, I'm joined today by Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam has spent more than a decade tracking Iran's internal politics, security forces, and regional ambitions. There is a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. Behnam, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Great to be with you, Aviva.
I'm so glad that you're here because there has been so much that is happening on the ground in Iran. Can you give us a picture of your understanding of the status on the ground right now?
Everybody's picture is tainted by the fact that there has been essentially a 2-week internet outage in Iran from the state against society to avoid what was the most significant protest movement in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic from actually gaining steam and winning. And so the three main reasons why the Islamic Republic relied on this playbook that we saw, which was to cut the internet and to kill Iranians under cover of darkness, was one, to impede coordination and communication between protesters, two, to be able to sever the bonds that had grown significantly between internal Iranian dissidents and protesters and external opposition and diaspora. And then the third and perhaps most proximate cause for this internet blackout was to replicate what, again, we had seen in the past from this regime, which is to kill Iranians under the cover of darkness and hope that the international community, particularly the West and America, does not notice. And the reason that kind of ties us into today is that the regime gets to weaponize the information space, gets to have those who sow doubt and dissent about the number of protesters killed. Yes, you have independent Western or Iranian American human rights organizations slowly being able to even scale up the confirmed kill count, which is around 3,500 to 4,500. But you have credible, major mainstream media reporting with sources in Iran, particularly I would say paying attention to lawyers, doctors, nurses, hospitals, morgues, and morticians, let alone family members of killed or captured protesters, painting an image of anywhere from 12,000 to 16,000 to 20,000 protesters, all killed under the cover of this internet blackout, all of which tells you that this is the most violently repressed protest movement in the history of not just the Islamic Republic, but really in the past century, given the speed of the crackdown from the state against the streets.
Let's talk about what made this particular wave of protests different from previous ones. So it began in late December, ostensibly about a severe economic crisis, record currency collapse, inflation hovering around or over 50%. But the protesters weren't making economic demands. They were calling for regime change. So can you help us to understand what was the catalyst and why was this protest movement different from previous ones?
This was triggered by an economic crisis, hyperinflation, the value of the rial relative to the US dollar the day the protest started, with 28th of December, if I'm not mistaken, was 1.43 million to the US dollars. In the weeks before that, you had even just seen on social media, Iranians talking about savings being disappeared, salaries being essentially worthless, restaurants having to so consistently change their menus that they lost clientele and wasn't even worth having a price on the board or a price printed on the page. So little real things that have real world ramifications. But what really makes the will and the bravery of Iranian protesters different this time is this is the most widespread protest movement touching all of Iran's 31 different provinces since the Women, Life, Freedom movement. To your first question, it is that the most powerful person in the world seemed, at least for a moment, to have wanted to make it different. And that was US President Donald Trump. And Donald Trump really earned the support of Iranian protesters in his first term because he torpedoed the conventional wisdom in Washington about A, putting foreign pressure on the regime, because he did that successfully with the maximum pressure policy. And he proved to DC audiences that actually, if you put foreign pressure, you wouldn't bring the society and state together. You could actually keep them apart. And that was what happened. And then two, as a follow-on, that if you gave even just political and rhetorical support to protesters, that protesters would not see that as the kiss of death. When you combined all the foreign and domestic elements, really made this protest movement fundamentally different and fundamentally historic, such that when you get to the numbers that we talked about today with the violence, my goodness, this is different because of how much the state fears what is going on in society, fears what is going on the street. And that's why the orders of shoot to kill had been given. The stories that have been increasingly coming out of Iran in dribs and drabs of people being killed in cars, people being killed in bread lines. Groups of 2 or 3 in Iran are terrified, really, to go out. People give you these horrible looks. There's plainclothes militiamen everywhere across major urban cities. And perhaps more than ever before, there has been credible reporting about Iran's Foreign Legion, the Shia militias of the region, actively doing protester suppression as well. So this is different, and this is dangerous.
To what extent do you think that Iranians went out onto the streets because of President Trump's statements, his posts on social media, and they were thinking that he had their back?
I strongly believe that President Trump's early January statement was like a shot in the arm, or I like to say a wind beneath the wings of Iranian protesters. Iranian protesters had ample reasons to go out anyway, and they had been going out anyway, but President Trump's rhetoric gave them a sense of support. I could say stiffened their spine. He didn't drive them to the street. He kept them on the street in a way that you heard stories of people knowing that they were going to their death, but having faith or having belief in the West, in America, in Israel.
But that's the distinction that I want to make. I understand that it was encouraging to get them on the street, but to what extent do you think that they thought, well, President Trump will take military action?
I don't think it's empirical, but I do believe we can say that many Iranians saw the historicity of President Trump's comments. And it wasn't a one-off where we could say this is Teflon Don, that he can say something and not necessarily have to pay the price. But Iranians, again, saw and heard on repeated attempts the president touch this issue, first on Truth Social, then on radio, then on video, then aboard Air Force One, then to press reporting. Obviously, it would be seen as credible to many, many Iranians.
And why do you think that President Trump backed off?
I mean, it remains to be seen how much he has backed off. He could be doing what President Trump does best. He cultivates ambiguity and he seeks leverage and elasticity, because I think 2025 showed us that perhaps more than any president in the post 9/11 world, President Trump really does seek all options on the table. I mean, the first 9 months he ran through, attempts to negotiate. He ran through multilateral pressure. He ran through maximum economic pressure. He ran through military action. He worked with the Europeans and the United Nations. It literally ran through the gambit of U.S. policy options on Iran that had been discussed in this town for 2 decades. He ran through the gambit in 9 months. And so I think here there is the chance that in terms of just the logistics of the situation, if there is going to be something kinetic, he may want to make sure all the assets are in place, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. 2, I think that the outreach by some of the partners that the U.S. does see as traditional and credible, and to help move to a different paradigm in the Middle East, which is the paradigm he articulated in his national security strategy about peace, prosperity, stability. Many of these are the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, who do fear a conflict and a contagion effect of the conflict, particularly coming onto their territory, not just the U.S. bases that may or may not be on their territory. So I think that too went after the president's thinking, the potential to really expand the scope of military conflict in the Middle East rather than to kind of contain it, and the title of peacemaker. And then the third is, the level of U.S. involvement that would have to come, or level of even U.S. time and political capital and attention that would have to follow in the event of a strike, even if it's successful, how to help build a better order in Iran, or if it's unsuccessful, because it's the Middle East, it can go from bad to worse. And I think all those variables led to Trump hedging thus far. It is a very politically costly and dangerous hedging, because the Iranian population in the heartland of the Muslim world is the most pro-American, the most pro-Israeli population.
That's a big statement. The most pro-American. Say more about that.
One of the greatest ironies of the Middle East is that sometimes you see state and society going in opposite directions. And with respect to Iran, you have a government that has for 4+ decades preferenced death to America and death to Israel. And you see a society that has increasingly moved away from that. And in the past decade and a half, 2 decades, sharply moved away from that. Just look at some societies in the heartland of the Middle East where the governments are traditional partners of the United States, and how those societies reacted to things like 9/11, to things like 10/7, the terrorist attacks against Israel from Hamas. And you see a fundamentally different response to those things from Iranian society versus from what you see Iranian state and even from the Arab and Muslim world. That kind of shows the uniqueness of this Iranian context. It's one of the places where if you flip the script, you empower the street against the state. You don't have to worry about an Islamist group or a Brotherhood-esque group coming into power. That is one of the few times you can actually make the situation more stable, more prosperous, because of the views, values, and preferences of the Iranian population, which is secular compared to their Islamist government, nationalist compared to their Islamist government, and seeking representative government compared to the state of their authoritarian, if not totalitarian government.
Let me ask you about what the U.S. could potentially do. Now, last week, all the commentators were talking about an American strike. You've pointed out that even if that had taken place, that didn't guarantee anything. Presumably, there's a lot of options on the table for what the U.S. could do to try to support the Iranian people and destabilize the regime. Perhaps it is a kinetic strike, in which case, what would be the target that could make it effective? But are there actually alternatives as well?
Even from within Iran itself, everyone is looking at the president to do something kinetic. That tells you something historic, because again, the Iranian population is an exceptionally nationalistic population. They have not lived through civil war, insurgency, and outright conflict on their territory for decades. The Iran-Iraq War was the last major experience, and that was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. And despite, what Tehran suffered in terms of civilian casualties and what most Western Iranian cities suffered in terms of civilian casualties, most of the war was fought on Iraqi territory. The 12-day war, which didn't have a single American or Israeli boot on the ground, was the most proximate thing after that. And that is not how the rest of the Middle East has experienced conflict or the cycles of violence from the 80s to the present. So fundamentally, one reason why you have such a nationalistic population looking abroad for some kind of answer is because they know they've come short against the regime that is armed to the teeth, that is willing to bring in foreign militias to kill their own compatriots, against the regime that has had no compunction squashing people on cyberspace or in the street. And fundamentally now, I think if there is something non-kinetic, not just will U.S. credibility around the world enforce deterrence under doubt, particularly in a world where we're looking to lock down the Western Hemisphere or pivot to the Asia Pacific to kind of deal with the rising China. But again, to the heart of that constituency, we may lose one of the most pro-American and most pro-Israeli and pro-Western constituencies in this very critical region. This is a sworn adversary of America, of the West, that currently, by the way, has a bounty on the head of the sitting president. And after the 12-day war, whose clerical establishment issued numerous fatwas against the president, his life, his property, and even the female members of his family. So this is a different situation that we're dealing with altogether, and just important for policymakers to realize that as they weigh kinetic versus non-kinetic. And you also mentioned some of the non-kinetic as well.
Well, my non-kinetic answer is, why is nobody hacking into Iran and turning on the internet? If somebody in the tech world could just send me an email and explain to me why we cannot override and turn on the internet, I would love to know.
Before the internet was even shut off, I don't know why on the non-kinetic side, no talking, no commentary, no politics, why NSA in America and Unit 8200 in Israel did not have a joint playbook ready to go. We need a bipartisan protest policy playbook for the next time protesters are out on the streets again, for the next time the regime shuts down the internet again. But policy options. Before, there should have been a full-pronged cyber campaign. 2, the command and control network should be taken out. This political establishment that can give the cascade of orders, and then this security establishment that can carry out the orders. These two, in terms of command and control, the spinal cord, whether kinetically or on the cyber side, on the high side, that spinal cord should be shredded. So they should not be able to communicate, coordinate, talk, share information with one another. These are the things that, when the protests were at their peak, could level the playing field between the street and the state. So in a world where Uncle Sam has not chosen what is the goal to which military action is being applied, this shredding of the command and control can help you begin to create the options for scaling up or scaling down, depending on whatever outcome you want. From that flows actually being able to suppress fire and the likelihood that you do something damaging to them, and then the regime responds with missiles. So, because at this point in time, sans going after the supreme leader's office, and again, that the political establishment, it's going to be hard to get the protesters back on the streets to see something that could give them that shot in the arm. And the last thing is, I would say, what needs to be thought of here is a campaign, sometimes low intensity and slow rather than high and fast. And I know that might not be something that the administration may want to do, but it is actually considerably cheaper. Think drones from regional bases rather than major standoff weaponry from bombers and carriers. And on the other side, things that we should have in place anyway is going after the regime shadow banking, enforcing maximum pressure sanctions, doing what we did with Venezuelan oil vis-a-vis Iranian oil, which is taking the tankers and then taking the oil and selling that and having asset forfeiture, and actually being able to develop a proper support the Iranian people policy, not with a single cent of U.S. taxpayer money, but with Iranian oil money that is confiscated, really putting Iran's partners, Russia and China, to the choice. We need more European countries to expel Iranian ambassadors. We need the IRGC sanctioned as a terrorist organization. Everything that can, again, put wind beneath the wings of the next round of Iranian protesters.
If you were to cut off the head of the regime, who is 86 years old and presumably is not going to be around so much longer, do you think that removing him from the equation, whether it's by an assassination or if it's eventually because he succumbs to old age or illness, that would be enough to end the regime or not?
One of the successes of this supreme leader compared to his predecessor, which is the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, is that he has no charismatic legitimacy, no charismatic authority. His success has been to bring in the barracks when he didn't have support from the mosque. So he's relied much more on the military to support his 3+ decades in charge as Iran's most powerful person. And yes, that title, Supreme Leader, is meant to be taken literally, but he's also institutionalized his support. So there is a line of thinking that says that going after the Supreme Leader is a one-and-done kind of operation, and I know that kind of seems attractive to the president, and I think it's also consistent with what we've seen with him in the past. I'm reminded very much of Machiavelli's The Prince, when the president used force against the nuclear program last summer, or with the Venezuela operation more recently.
He's got a precedent for taking out the guy at the top.
Exactly. And the line from The Prince, because these were very public operations, was to satisfy and stupefy, to satisfy a constituency and then amaze and bewilder another one. And I think that is entirely consistent with President Trump's character. But we have to realize is that, this is not just merely a sultanistic state. If you show to the population that the most powerful person, the so-called most powerful person in that system is taken out or collapses on itself, yes, you could drive the next round of protests, but fundamentally, what would make somebody in some small town go out is not just the supreme leader being taken out. It's actually that local guard corps, that local Basij office. So think major ramifications, global ramifications, but think local.
The more immediate threat is what's animating.
And the thing that could have a positive reverberation effect is if the supreme leader's office is not the only potential target, but it's, again, that plus the security forces, or something that is, again, seen, like potentially the IRIB, the Islamic Republic of Iran broadcaster, the sanctioned state broadcaster. Things that, again, put wind beneath the wings, because the cost of actually getting people onto the streets again is significantly higher than ever before, given the trust deficit now and the mass violence from the state against the street now.
There is so much more that I wish I could talk to you about, but we are over time. So let me just finish by asking you one question. Do you think that the regime is going to survive this round?
It's clear that this is a marathon, not a sprint against this regime. And in so many ways, the revolution has already happened in Iran. If revolutions are a social phenomenon, we have already had the pushing past the state by a very bold society since December 2017, if not earlier, by the brave young Iranian women, young Iranian men, middle-aged and even older Iranians who have kind of atoned and come in a fundamentally different direction. I think we're just waiting for the commensurate political change in Iran to reflect that different societal change. And how that change comes about, that remains to be seen. But fundamentally, I am hopeful because, again, the resiliency of the average Iranian protester, the justness of their cause, and again, the intersection between that and U.S. national security strategy kind of is begging for everyone to connect the dots to say that we shouldn't let this regime be able to build back better, whether it's to survive another 12-day war or to survive another nationwide uprising against it. So I do think fundamentally, when you have a regime having to weigh so heavily and lean so heavily on guns like this and on mass violence like this, its days are already marked.
Behnam, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. This show is produced by Yochai Meital and Alma Ben Zev. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we are so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you nod vigorously, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 easy ways to support the show. First, follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit and we rely on donors like you. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.